Welcome to this otherwise very short series on architecture and quarantine. You might ask yourself, what does architecture have to do with quarantine? Well, in essence, architecture is the way we control physical elements to contain things, to contain air, temperature, people going into one place or the other. And in reality, it's more about restraining freedom of some things so others can be carried out. On its extreme conditions, of course, it is an excellent medium to isolate, and that has been used through history. In this first very short chapter, we're going to talk about some examples of how architecture was an aid to containment in pandemics. Perhaps one of the first uses of architecture as a control system was the design of ships themselves, which were a self-contained autonomous element on otherwise a territory that was quite inaccessible, that is the sea. Hence, when in Dubrovnik in the 1300s, the first quarantine was enforced due to the high levels of trade, ships were used as isolation systems on their own. But perhaps the most interesting aspect of that legislation was the introduction of time into the equation, not only a physical containment, but through a space of time. The idea of the ship as an isolated element worked really well, and that was developed not that later on in the Venetian lagoon, when Venice in the 1400s started to create its first lazarettos, or isolated islands specifically designed for containing individuals that came through the harbor or were sick in the cities, and isolating them until they were healthy or died. So these small institutions, in a way, created the possibility of a new typology. It harbored the values of the time: churches, cemeteries, accommodation, ways of creating food, and they became micro cities. That wasn't new. It was perhaps already used in the leper houses of the Middle Ages, but it started to evolve as a typology on its own right. And ideas of containment have been used ever since, from tuberculosis, the way that master plans like the Cerdà Barcelona plan of the 1800s had health and ventilation and sun exposure as part of a new way of understanding not only an urban strategy, but also the way that accommodation or housing was structured. Obviously, that impacted also hospitals and how the cruciform hospital or different wings attached to a center core allowed for that exposure of higher ceilings, higher windows, and better airflow. But all the way to perhaps present day understanding of how we contain elements. And we can see how we are revisiting our own accommodation. We're revisiting how we understand a flat or a house, when it suddenly also has to become a workspace, a school, a training facility, a space for solace. So perhaps after this containment, we'll start to think of new ways of designing what we consider our home.